Hello friends! In this video we are probing farther into our module 15 in our biology class. We're looking at pages 472 to 482. So we're kicking off this video with a very interesting look at insectivorous plants. And these plants, an example of the Venus flytrap, has leaves that trap and digest insects. And this movement of the leaves is considered a nastic movement since it's not dependent on the direction from which the insect lands. And I am going to be posting the links to these YouTube videos if you want them on Google Classroom, if you want to take a look at it in action. It's very interesting because on the inside of the leaves they have these sensors. They're sort of like hair-like projections that detect the movement of the fly, and you'll notice that the leaves don't close the second the fly lands. It usually takes a little bit of movement on the leaf and then eventually they do close. The book points out an interesting fact that the plant still produces most of its food by photosynthesis in the leaves. However, the reason, more or less, that they will trap the flies is that they need the nutrients from the flies, like nitrogen, that are lacking in the soil that they grow in. And it says, however, when they grow in soil that's lacking sufficient levels of these nutrients, the plant will generate more of these fly-catching leaves to sort of balance out its intake of nutrients. All right, so we kick it off with our first on-your-own question, 15.7. In order to be healthy, a Venus flytrap needs insects, water, and what else? So our answer is relating to the leaves here. It says it needs light and carbon dioxide because it does photosynthesize food, and you can see the green color of the leaves show us that it is photosynthetic. All right, so let's take a look at reproduction in plants. They have a nice review here from our previous module. We know that bryophytes and seedless vascular plants like mosses produce spores in one generation and gametes in another. And then we have conifers that reproduce by producing pollen in pollen cones and eggs in seed cones. And now we're in this module we'll be looking at flowering plants that use flowers for sexual reproduction. But there's also a form of asexual reproduction, right, the A there, that's considered vegetative reproduction, and that is when the plant is more or less cloning itself in the second generation. All right, so let's look at some examples of vegetative reproduction. One might be when a plant forms small plantlets on the leaves. So you have like a large plant growing here, and then it has these smaller plantlets. My friends used to call those babies. You can cut those off and replant those as well. Then you have underground stems in the roots. That would be something like mint, which grows it really flourishes if you ever have mint in your yard or you see it. This is a very effective way of allowing the plant to spread in a certain area. Then there's tubers or roots. Remember, tubers are actually specialized stems, and a potato is a tuber, or you can have roots that grow into new plants. You can also have runners or above ground stems, and we'll be looking at an example of that in strawberries. You can have broken stems that make new roots. An example would be blackberries. And then interestingly, some plants can even be transplanted by the use of leaves. An example of that is the African violet. And so the one thing they all have in common is that the offspring are essentially clones of the parents. They're genetically identical. And here is an example of the runner system in strawberries. So you have a parent plant which sends out a specialized stem that then can differentiate and grow roots and establish a new plant, and then that one also can continue to send out additional runners. Another way of let's say maintaining new plants, but obviously this isn't something that happens naturally, it's by human intervention, but we have this concept of grafting, and that's when you can take a stem from one plant and it's cut off and then attach it mechanically, notice how it's just bound by cloth or tape or something, to the stem of another plant, or like the base of another plant, and this one can still continue to grow even though there's no genetic material exchange between the two plants. So in this situation, the stem is called the scion, and the initial base plant is called the stock. So one type of grafting is on sort of the side of the stock, and in this case, this stock is cut in more of a V-shaped pattern, and the scion is attached inside of there. Okay, so let's look at On Your Own, page 475. It says, a gardener is experimenting with one of her African violet plants. The plant produces large colored flowers, so this is supposed to be the parent plant. She shows you two offspring from the plant. The first produces small, lightly colored flowers, and while the second produces large, deeply colored flowers. Which offspring was produced with vegetative reproduction, and which one was produced with sexual reproduction? So the answer here lies in whether or not the offspring is identical or not. So the first one was sexual reproduction because the offspring here was not identical. So in this case, you have another plant contributing genetic material and you have more diversity in the offspring. The second was produced by vegetative reproduction because the offspring is identical to the parent plant. All right, On Your Own, 15.9. A gardener wants to graft a limb from a Macintosh apple tree onto another tree so that he can have more Macintosh apples. Should he use his Red Delicious tree or his wild cherry tree? So the answer here is just sort of a practical tip. He said he should use the Red Delicious tree because it's closer to the same species and more likely to be successful in the grafting. All right, so this is just a little slide I threw in myself. It's a review of our classification system, and just to show at the broadest term, right, starts at our kingdom, then it gets more specific: phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And so I just wanted you to understand that when we're looking at this word phylum, that we're referring back to that classification system. So here we have sexual reproduction in the phylum Anthophyta, in other words, flowering plants. And we're going to look in detail at this figure 15.6. So the book groups the basic parts of a flower into 5 basic groups, where you have the pedicel and the sepals, which are these like leaf-like projections at the base here. Then the petals, these pinkish colored. The stamen is this collective group over here. It was the male reproductive part. It has filaments and the anther and pollen grains on the anther. And then the carpel is on over here. And this is considered the female reproductive part. It has what's considered the stigma, the style, and the ovary. And this produces embryo sacs which contain eggs. So interestingly, flowers can be classified into 2 different categories: what you call a perfect flower that has both the stamen and the carpel in one flower, and that's would be including roses, lilies, and apples. But then there's other flowers that you'd classify as imperfect because they have either a stamen or a carpel, but not both. And so that would be include squash and begonia. So some plants can self-fertilize and some cannot. All right, so let's look at the function of the parts of the flower. So first of all, the pedicel down here holds the flower up, and the receptacle is this portion at the top of the pedicel, and it's sort of reinforced to support the flower. Then you have the sepals here, help to protect the flower. When the flower is first immature, those sepals are wrapped up around it. And then we have the petals, which may contain carotenoids, which produce a fragrant smell that attracts animals. And then the animals eventually can transport the pollen that you'd find on the anther to other flowers. So what's interesting too is there's something called composite flowers. This includes daisies and sunflowers, and these have, even though they look like one flower, I think you would just call that one flower, but from a biological standpoint, right, there's many individual flowers that are all sort of packaged together into this one structure. Okay, on your own 478, 15.10, is there any way a plant that produces imperfect flowers can sexually reproduce with itself? Why or why not? So the answer here is if one of its flowers can produce the stamen, that would be here, and another the carpel, like on the same plant, it can self-fertilize. However, if it only produces, say, one or the other of these, then it cannot self-fertilize. All right, another on your own, 1511. Suppose a flower has a carpel with a very short style. Remember, the style is this projection here. Which would you consider to be the best means of transferring pollen grains to the carpel, the wind or an animal? Well, in this case, if the style is short, right, it may not be exposed to the wind, so the best means of pollination would be an animal. Okay, so we're going to take just a brief look at meiosis. This slide's not in the chapter, but I just wanted to remind you that when a cell goes through meiosis, and notice it doesn't have the T there, it's not mitosis but meiosis, you start with a full complement of chromosomes, and then through a series of cell division, then you come up with haploid cells, cells that have half the number of chromosomes. So let's look at the reproductive process in anthophytes, and I'm looking at figure 15.7 on page 480. And so we are zeroing in here on the anther where you find these pollen sacs. And here, inside the pollen sac, you have what's called the diploid cells, so that's a full complement of chromosomes that then undergo meiosis, and the one diploid cell produces 4 haploid cells, which are called microspores. And these have a fairly thick wall or encasing around it. Then, interestingly, these microspores undergo mitosis, so they have the same complement of genetic material here and here, but they're just dividing. After the mitosis, each one of those haploid cells becomes, it goes from, say, 1 nucleus to 2 nuclei because of the mitosis. And one of the cells in the casing becomes a tube nucleus, and the other one differentiates into a sperm cell. And when this happens, the casing is reinforced and it becomes a pollen grain. So you see here, from one diploid cell, you produce 4 pollen grains. All right, so this is now looking at embryo sac formation, and I'm in figure 15.8. Now here, we're looking at this ovary in the egg, in the flower, and you have what's called an ovule. This structure here begins forming on the inside wall of the ovary. Here you have one diploid cell, right? It has the full complement of chromosomes, and that divides by meiosis, and you have 4 haploid cells. Now, out of those 4, 3 would be considered polar bodies and basically disintegrate, are not used anymore, but it's as similar to animals. However, 1 becomes what's called the megaspore, and it's still haploid, but it's the one that will proceed on. Okay, this megaspore undergoes mitosis, so it divides and it creates 2 nuclei here. It's still encased in 1 cell, but it's 2 nuclei. And then that undergoes cell division, or nuclei division, I should say. And then another nuclei division until finally you have 8 haploid nuclei in that 1 cell. Now, once it has that full complement of the 8 nuclei, you finally have cell membranes forming, so that you actually have a total of 7 cells here. There's 6 of these green small cells, and then 1 in the middle here, the large cell with 2 nuclei. So the 6 smaller ones have 1 nucleus, and then the gray one here in the middle has the 2 nuclei. And that would be completing the process for the formation of the embryo sac. All right, so let's take a look at On Your Own 15.12. If a pollen sac contains 1,000 diploid cells before the formation of pollen grains, how many pollen grains could there be in the pollen case once pollen formation is complete? All right, so we're going to be looking at this figure here. So the answer is, we have 1 diploid cell produces 4 pollen grains. Then if you're starting with 1,000 of these, you multiply that by 4, and the answer is 4,000 pollen grains for every 1,000 of the diploid cell. All right, after 15.13, after the original cell of an ovule undergoes meiosis and forms 1 viable megaspore, so that's here. So we have the diploid cell going through meiosis and forming 1 megaspore. How many times does mitosis occur in order to get a total of 8 nuclei in the megaspore? So here we have, after the first mitosis, you have 2. Then it goes through another mitosis, there's 4. And then finally a third, and that's 8. So the megaspore undergoes mitosis 3 times. Okay, so that is the end of that part of the unit, and we will look at the next section in the next video.